Professor Kethvar adjusted his ceremonial teaching robes and gazed across the pristine lecture hall of the Galactic Military Academy. The morning light filtered through the massive transparent steel windows, casting geometric shadows across rows of perfectly aligned desks. Each seat was occupied by the galaxy's finest military minds, or at least, that's what the brochures claimed. "Welcome, cadets, to Advanced Strategic Theory," Kethvar announced, his voice carrying the natural authority of someone who had never questioned his own intelligence. "Today we shall examine the fundamental principles of civilized warfare." The professor's 6 eyes swept across his diverse classroom with obvious pride. There sat Cadet Zil Nara from the crystalline Vorthak Empire, her translucent skin shimmering as she took notes with mechanical precision. Beside her, young Thekmor of the Quillan Confederation bobbed his massive head, all 4 arms already busy recording every word. The insectoid representative from the hive clusters clicked approvingly, while the aquatic delegate from Oceanus Prime gurgled what passed for enthusiasm among his species. All proper, civilized beings from advanced societies, all following protocol, all predictable. Then there was the human. Marcus Kane slouched in his chair like he was watching entertainment rather than receiving education from one of the galaxy's most respected military theorists. The Deathworlder appeared completely relaxed, which any sensible being knew was impossible in the presence of such academic excellence. His primitive clothing looked almost casual compared to the formal attire of his classmates, and those strange, outward-facing predator eyes seemed to find everything mildly amusing. Kethvar suppressed a sigh. The Academy's diversity initiative had really outdone itself this semester. Allowing a representative from a barely spacefaring species was one thing, but a species from a Class 12 Deathworld? The bureaucrats had clearly lost their collective minds. Still, the humans served a purpose. Nothing taught proper military doctrine quite like having a living example of what happened when civilizations developed without proper guidance. The primitive creature would provide excellent contrast to demonstrate the superiority of evolved tactical thinking. "Now then," Kethvar continued, turning toward the holographic display board, "let us begin with the most fundamental concept in military strategy. The art of knowing when one has been decisively defeated." Behind him, Marcus Kane raised an eyebrow with what could only be described as polite confusion, though the professor was far too busy preparing his lecture to notice the ominous sign. Professor Kethvar activated the holographic display with a flourish that suggested he truly believed he was about to impart the wisdom of the ages. 3-dimensional star charts materialized above the lecture podium, showing fleet formations in various states of tactical disadvantage. "Observe, cadets, the elegant beauty of strategic withdrawal and honorable surrender," he announced, his voice taking on the reverent tone usually reserved for discussing sacred texts. "These concepts form the very foundation of civilized warfare." The alien students leaned forward with eager anticipation. Cadet Zil Nara's crystalline fingers danced across her datapad, recording every syllable with the dedication of a scholar preserving ancient wisdom. Thekmor's 4 arms moved in perfect synchronization, creating detailed diagrams of surrender protocols. Even the hive cluster representative clicked its mandibles in what passed for enthusiastic note-taking among its species. "You see," Kethvar continued, manipulating the hologram to show a fleet in obvious disadvantage. "When faced with superior numbers, advanced technology, or tactical impossibility, the enlightened commander recognizes the futility of continued resistance." He paused dramatically, allowing his words to sink in. "This is not cowardice, cadets. This is intelligence." The professor gestured toward a particularly elegant surrender formation displayed in the hologram. "Notice the grace with which the defeated fleet arranges itself. Weapons powered down in precise sequence, shields lowered according to galactic protocol, and communication arrays broadcasting the traditional surrender frequencies. Beautiful, is it not?" A chorus of agreement rippled through the classroom. Cadet Zil Nara actually sighed with appreciation, while Thekmor began sketching surrender formations with artistic flair. The aquatic student from Oceanus Prime bubbled something that his translator rendered as aesthetically pleasing tactical resolution. Meanwhile, Marcus Kane sat motionless in his chair, wearing an expression that could generously be described as bewildered. His head tilted slightly to one side, like a confused animal trying to understand a particularly strange sound. The human's mouth twitched occasionally, suggesting internal struggle between confusion and what appeared to be suppressed laughter. The surrender process itself, Kethvar explained with growing enthusiasm, follows strict galactic conventions established over millennia of civilized conflict. First, the defeated commander must formally acknowledge tactical superiority through the appropriate communication channels. Second, all weapons systems must be deactivated according to species-specific protocols. Third, command codes must be transmitted to demonstrate good faith. The professor manipulated the hologram again, showing the formal surrender ceremony in all its bureaucratic glory. Notice how the defeated fleet maintains perfect formation while awaiting instructions from their conquerors. This demonstrates respect for the victor and acknowledgement of one's own tactical inadequacy. Marcus Kane's eyebrows had climbed so high they seemed in danger of disappearing entirely into his hairline. He shifted in his seat, opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again with a slight shake of his head. The human appeared to be having some sort of internal philosophical crisis. The beauty of this system, Kethvar concluded with obvious satisfaction, lies in its logical perfection. When defeat becomes mathematically certain, continued resistance serves no purpose except to waste resources and lives. The intelligent being recognizes this reality and acts accordingly. He turned to face his students with the smug expression of someone who had just delivered profound truth. After all, what is the alternative to reasonable surrender? Mindless, futile resistance until total annihilation? Such behavior would be, he searched for the appropriate term, primitive. At this, Marcus Kane's expression shifted from confusion to something that might have been recognition. A slow smile began to spread across his face, though whether it indicated understanding or something far more dangerous remained unclear. The professor unfortunately interpreted this as eager comprehension rather than the warning sign it actually represented. Marcus Kane's hand rose into the air with the slow, deliberate motion of someone who had just encountered a completely foreign concept. The gesture was so unexpected that Professor Kethvar actually paused mid-sentence, his prepared lecture on surrender etiquette dying on his lips. "Yes, Cadet Kane?" the professor asked, his tone carrying just enough condescension to remind everyone present of the vast intellectual gulf between advanced civilizations and primitive Deathworlders. Marcus shifted in his seat, his expression maintaining that peculiar mixture of genuine curiosity and barely contained amusement. "Sorry, Professor, but I think I missed something fundamental here. Could you maybe explain this surrender thing again? Like from the beginning?" A ripple of barely suppressed chuckles ran through the classroom. Several alien students exchanged knowing glances, clearly anticipating the entertainment value of watching their primitive classmate receive remedial education in basic military concepts. Professor Kethvar's chest swelled with the pride of someone about to demonstrate superior knowledge to an obviously inferior mind. "Of course, Cadet Kane. I should have realized that such concepts might be unfamiliar to someone from your particular background." The professor activated a simplified holographic display, the kind typically reserved for first-year students or particularly slow learners. "Surrender, my dear primitive colleague, is the act of formally acknowledging defeat and ceasing all hostile actions. When a military commander realizes that victory is impossible, he communicates his submission to the enemy forces and agrees to their terms." Marcus nodded slowly, as if processing this revolutionary information. "Okay, so let me make sure I understand this correctly. When things get really bad, when you're outnumbered and outgunned, when everything looks hopeless," he paused, his eyes brightening as if a great truth was dawning. "You just give up?" "Precisely," Kethvar exclaimed, clearly delighted by his student's apparent breakthrough. "You formally acknowledge the superior tactical position of your opponent and negotiate terms for your defeat. It is the hallmark of an intelligent species." The human sat back in his chair, a slow grin spreading across his face like sunrise breaking over a particularly interesting battlefield. "Well, that's fascinating, Professor. Really fascinating." His voice carried a tone that made several of the more perceptive alien students shift uncomfortably in their seats. "There's just one tiny problem with your whole theory." The classroom fell silent. Professor Kethvar blinked his 6 eyes in sequence, waiting for the primitive to elaborate. Marcus Kane's grin widened to show entirely too many predator teeth. "We don't use that word." The silence stretched for exactly 3 heartbeats before chaos erupted. Cadet Zil Nara's crystalline form began flickering with nervous energy. Thekmore's 4 arms tangled together in confusion. The Hive cluster representative's clicking reached a frequency that suggested mild panic, while the aquatic student's bubbling took on distinctly agitated undertones. Professor Kethvar stared at the human with the expression of someone who had just discovered that mathematics might be optional. "I beg your pardon?" he managed to croak. Professor Kethvar's 6 eyes blinked in rapid succession, a sure sign that his advanced alien brain was struggling to process what he had just heard. The classroom's nervous chatter gradually died down as everyone waited to see how their esteemed instructor would handle this unprecedented situation. "You don't use that word?" Kethvar repeated slowly, as if speaking to someone with a severe head injury. "Cadet Kane, perhaps you misunderstood the concept. Surrender is not merely a word, it is a fundamental military reality. All intelligent species understand this basic principle." Marcus Kane shrugged with the casual indifference of someone discussing the weather. "Maybe that's the problem right there, Professor. You keep using that word intelligent like it means what you think it means." The professor's teaching robes rustled as he drew himself up to his full, impressive height. Clearly, the primitive required a more direct educational approach. "Very well, Cadet Kane. Since theoretical instruction appears insufficient for your particular limitations, perhaps a practical demonstration would prove more enlightening." Kethvar moved to the advanced tactical simulator with the purposeful stride of someone about to deliver a crushing lesson in reality. The holographic projector hummed to life, creating a 3-dimensional star system complete with planets, asteroid fields, and strategic chokepoints. "Class, we shall now conduct a live tactical exercise," the professor announced with obvious relish. "Cadet Kane, you will command a human fleet." He manipulated the controls, and a pitiful collection of ships materialized in the hologram. 12 vessels. Primitive technology. Limited resources. Standard human naval composition, such as it is. The alien students leaned forward with eager anticipation. This was going to be better than entertainment. This was going to be educational massacre. "The rest of you," Kethvar continued, gesturing grandly toward his other students, "will represent the combined forces of the Galactic Alliance. Cadet Zilnara, you command the Vorthak crystal ships. Thekmore, take the Quillen battle formations. Everyone else, assume control of your respective species' naval assets." The holographic display shifted, revealing an absolutely overwhelming alien armada. Hundreds of ships materialized, representing the combined military might of dozens of advanced civilizations. Energy weapons that could crack planets, shields that had never been breached, tactical computers that could process 1,000,000 scenarios per second. "The scenario is simple," Professor Kethvar explained with barely concealed glee. "The human fleet has stumbled into Alliance space and refuses to acknowledge territorial sovereignty. The Alliance forces have been ordered to secure their surrender through appropriate diplomatic pressure." Marcus Kane studied the holographic display with the same expression he might wear while examining an interesting rock. "So let me get this straight. 12 human ships versus," he paused to count, his lips moving silently. "Roughly 400 alien vessels with superior technology, better weapons and tactical advantages in every conceivable category?" "Precisely," Kethvar confirmed. "A textbook example of when immediate surrender represents the only logical choice. Even the most primitive species should recognize such overwhelming odds." The human nodded thoughtfully. "And you expect me to surrender immediately to demonstrate proper civilized behavior?" "Exactly." Finally, the primitive shows signs of basic comprehension. The professor turned to address the entire class. "Observe, cadets, how even the most backward species can be taught to recognize military reality when presented with undeniable evidence. Marcus Kane stood up slowly, moving to the tactical interface with the relaxed gait of someone taking a casual stroll. He placed his hands on the control panel and looked up at the massive alien fleet surrounding his tiny human force. "Professor, I think there might be a small misunderstanding here about human military doctrine." "Oh?" Kethvar asked with patronizing interest. "And what misunderstanding would that be?" The human's grin returned, wider and more predatory than before. "You seem to think that being outnumbered 400 to 12 is a problem." He activated the human fleet's communication systems, and his voice echoed through the simulated star system with cheerful confidence. "This is Admiral Kane to all Alliance forces. I've received your surrender demands, and I have to say, I'm flattered by the attention. 400 ships just for us? You really shouldn't have." The alien students exchanged confused glances. Cadet Zil Nara's crystalline form flickered with uncertainty. Is he accepting our terms?" Marcus Kane's voice continued broadcasting through the simulation. "Unfortunately, I'm going to have to decline your generous offer. You see, we have a strict policy about surrender. We don't do it. Ever. So if you want our ships, you're going to have to come and take them." Professor Kethvar stared at the tactical display with the expression of someone watching the fundamental laws of physics being casually violated. This is not how the scenario is supposed to proceed. The human looked up from his controls with innocent curiosity. "Oh, I'm sorry. Was there a script?" What followed could only be described as the systematic demolition of every military principle Professor Kethvar had spent his entire career teaching. Marcus Kane approached the tactical simulation with the casual enthusiasm of someone playing a particularly entertaining game, was completely oblivious to the fact that he was supposed to lose. "Alliance Fleet, this is Admiral Kane responding to your second surrender demand," Marcus announced cheerfully into the communication system. "I appreciate the formality, but I'm afraid we're going to have to pass. You see, surrendering would require paperwork, and frankly, none of us brought pens." Cadet Zil Nara's crystalline form flickered with genuine confusion. But that doesn't make logical sense. Surely they have digital communication systems." "That's the point," Thekmore whispered, his forearms trembling slightly. "He's not being logical." Professor Kethvar watched in growing horror as Marcus began implementing what could generously be called tactics, though they bore no resemblance to anything taught in any civilized military academy. The human fleet broke formation immediately, scattering in directions that seemed to follow no pattern whatsoever. Cadet Kane. The professor called out, "You cannot simply ignore tactical doctrine. Maintain formation coherence." "Formation coherence is for people who want to be easily targeted," Marcus replied without looking up from his controls. "We prefer the technical term making ourselves really annoying to hit." The alien students began implementing their own battle plans, confident that superior numbers and technology would quickly end this embarrassing display. Cadet Zil Nara's crystal ships moved in perfect geometric formations, their energy weapons charging with mathematical precision. Thekmore coordinated his battle groups with textbook efficiency, while the hive cluster vessels advanced in synchronized swarms. It should have been over in minutes. Instead, Marcus Kane began broadcasting what could only be described as psychological terrorism disguised as casual conversation. "Hey, Alliance Fleet, quick question," his voice echoed through the simulation. "How many of you have actually been in real combat before?" "Not simulation combat, I mean actual people trying to kill you combat?" "Because you're moving like you've never had someone shoot back before." Several alien students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Cadet Zil Nara's targeting systems wavered slightly as uncertainty crept into her tactical calculations. "This is Commander Zil Nara to Admiral Kane," she transmitted formally. "Your psychological attempts are ineffective. We outnumber you significantly." "Oh, absolutely," Marcus agreed cheerfully. "You've got us beat by a lot. Quick math question, though. How many of your ships can you afford to lose before this stops being worth it?" Because I'm thinking we can probably take at least 50 of you down before you get all of us. Maybe 60 if we get creative. The human fleet suddenly accelerated directly toward the center of the alien formation. Not in any recognizable attack pattern, not following any tactical doctrine anyone had ever seen, but in what appeared to be a completely suicidal charge. "He's lost his mind," Thekmor whispered. "No sane commander would order a direct assault against those odds." "That's what makes it terrifying," the Hive Cluster representative clicked nervously. "Insanity is unpredictable." Professor Kethvar found himself leaning forward, despite his better judgment. The human ships were weaving through the alien formation like maniacs, completely ignoring the devastating firepower being directed at them. Several human vessels took heavy damage, but instead of retreating or requesting medical assistance, they seemed to become more aggressive. "Alliance Fleet, this is the HSS Persistence," came another human voice through the communication system. "Our engines are failing and our weapons are at 30%. We're going to ram the nearest crystal ship because, honestly, what else are we going to do?" "You're going to what?" Cadet Zilnara shrieked, her perfect formation dissolving as she frantically tried to avoid the incoming human vessel. "Oh, that's just Peterson," Marcus explained conversationally. "He gets cranky when people shoot at him." "Don't take it personally." The simulation erupted into chaos as human ships began implementing tactics that violated every principle of self-preservation. Damaged vessels rammed enemy formations instead of retreating. Ships with failing life support systems used their remaining power to boost weapons instead of shields. One human captain actually jettisoned his escape pods toward enemy ships and then detonated them like improvised mines. "This is impossible," Professor Kethvar sputtered. "No rational being would sacrifice their forces so wastefully." "Who said anything about rational?" Marcus asked, ducking slightly as simulated weapons fire flashed overhead in the hologram. "We're humans. Rationality is more of a guideline than a rule." The alien students were now genuinely panicking. Their superior numbers meant nothing when their opponents refused to behave predictably. Every tactical computer in the simulation was generating error messages as it tried to process combat behavior that fell completely outside established parameters. "Alliance Fleet, this is Admiral Kane with an update," Marcus announced as his flagship somehow managed to position itself directly behind the enemy command vessel. "We've been thinking about your surrender terms, and we'd like to make a counteroffer." What kind of counteroffer?" Thekmor asked weakly. "You surrender to us, and we promise to accept it graciously. We might even let some of you keep your ships." The classroom fell silent, except for the sound of Professor Kethvar's 6 eyes blinking in rapid succession. On the tactical display, the human fleet, despite suffering heavy casualties, had somehow maneuvered the vastly superior alien forces into a position where continuing the fight would cost more than anyone was willing to pay. "This is not how military science works," the professor whispered to himself. Marcus Kane looked up from his controls with that same innocent expression he'd worn all morning. "Professor, I think you might be right about one thing. This really is educational." The alien students stared at him with expressions of dawning horror as they began to realize that the primitive Deathworlder wasn't losing the simulation. He was winning it. The final moments of the simulation unfolded with the inexorable certainty of a natural disaster. Professor Kethvar watched his carefully constructed educational scenario collapse as Marcus Kane's remaining human ships executed what could only be described as tactically impossible maneuvers. "Alliance Fleet, this is Admiral Kane with a final status update," the human announced with infuriating cheerfulness. "We've got 3 ships left. You've got about 200. And somehow we're still here having this conversation. Anyone else find that weird?" Cadet Zil Nara's crystal ships had taken such heavy losses that her formation resembled abstract art more than military deployment. Thekmor's 4 arms were tangled in knots of stress as he tried to coordinate an attack against opponents who refused to stay where tactics said they should be. The Hive Cluster representative had stopped clicking entirely, apparently having achieved some sort of insectoid nervous breakdown. The mathematical probability of human survival should be 0, Thekmore whispered, his voice cracking with strain. This violates everything we know about combat efficiency. That's because you're thinking like prey animals, Marcus explained helpfully while his flagship somehow avoided destruction through what appeared to be sheer force of personality. See, when you're from a death world, impossible odds aren't really impossible. They're just Tuesday. The humans' remaining vessels had positioned themselves in such a way that destroying them would require the alien fleet to damage their own ships in the crossfire. Worse yet, the psychological effect of fighting opponents who treated overwhelming firepower as a minor inconvenience had completely shattered alien morale. I request permission to withdraw my forces, Cadet Zil-Nara announced shakily. The cost of continuing this engagement exceeds acceptable parameters. Same here, Thekmore added quickly. My tactical computers are generating error messages I've never seen before. One by one, the alien students began withdrawing their fleets from the simulation. Not because they had been defeated militarily, but because the human refusal to acknowledge defeat had made victory meaningless. Professor Kethvar stared at the tactical display where 3 battered human ships floated among the wreckage of what had been a perfectly reasonable military exercise. His entire understanding of strategic theory lay in smoking ruins around him. How? He managed to croak. How is this possible? Marcus Kane powered down his controls and stretched casually, as if he had just finished a mildly interesting puzzle rather than rewriting the fundamental laws of military engagement. Oh, that's easy, Professor. You based your whole strategy on the assumption that we'd eventually see reason and give up. The human looked around the classroom at his traumatized classmates with genuine curiosity. So, when do we get to the lesson on winning against impossible odds? Because honestly, that's kind of our specialty. Professor Kethvar opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again like a fish gasping for water. We don't have a lesson on that. It's theoretically impossible. Marcus Kane grinned that predatory smile one more time. Well, then I guess you're about to learn something new. Professor Kethvar dismissed his class 20 minutes early, claiming he needed time to review the simulation data for anomalies. In reality, he needed to sit down before his legs gave out completely. His carefully structured universe of military logic had just been trampled by a grinning primitive who treated impossible odds like a minor scheduling conflict. The alien students filed out in stunned silence, occasionally glancing back at Marcus Kane with expressions typically reserved for natural disasters or cosmic horror. In the hallway, nervous whispers followed in their wake. Did you see how he smiled when they told him the odds? 400 to 12, and he acted like he had the advantage. They don't surrender. Ever. What kind of species doesn't surrender? The dangerous kind. Marcus Kane packed his belongings with the same casual indifference he had shown throughout the entire ordeal, completely oblivious to the psychological trauma he had inflicted on an entire classroom of advanced alien minds. He whistled tunelessly as he headed for the door, probably thinking about lunch. Professor Kethvar remained seated long after the human left, staring at the empty simulation display. Somewhere in the galaxy, there was an entire planet full of beings who thought like Marcus Kane. The professor shuddered and made a mental note to recommend immediate diplomatic immunity for Earth, just in case.